and welcome to the launch of the IEA's new in-depth review of the energy policies of Canada. I'm Jethro Mullen, Senior Editor in the IEA's Communications team, and I'm joined today by our Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, Canada's Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson, and IEA Energy Analyst, Divya Redy, the lead author of the new report. After opening remarks by Dr. Birol, Ms. Redy will present the key findings of the report. Minister Wilkinson will then provide his response to the findings. After that, we will have time for questions from the media. For the journalists taking part in this press webinar, we invite you to submit your questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom. You can do this at any point during the presentation, starting now. With that, I'll hand over to our Executive Director, Dr. Birol.
Thank you very much, Jethro. Greetings to Mr. Minister and all our friends and colleagues in Canada from the International Energy Agency headquarters in Paris. Dear colleagues, our agency, the International Energy Agency, conducts peer reviews for our member countries. This in-depth reviews covers all energy sources, oil, gas, renewables, electricity, how we consume them, how the markets are designed, and we discuss all relevant stakeholders in a given country to get their views, their perspectives, and discuss with the big delegation of experts coming from different countries and also in our secretariat, and to make a report and release our critics and recommendations for the governments, hopefully to take into consideration. These days, when we make those in-depth reviews, we look at the country's energy markets from two distinct perspectives: clean energy transitions and energy security. Our team, a very strong team, conducted the in-depth review of the Canadian energy policies. I would say a few months it took for us, and it finished in February last year. And the team members included experts from United States. In fact, the leader of the team was Mrs. Ambassador Mary Warlick, who later on became my deputy here at the IEA. But we have also government representatives and experts from Germany, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom, and from Nuclear Energy Agency. And my colleague Divya Redy was in charge of putting it together. I would like to thank here the Canadian government, in particular Natural Resources of Canada, for the excellent cooperation during the visit and throughout the review process. During our discussions, my colleagues and our team not only had meetings with the government, with the Natural Resources of Canada, but different ministries, regulators, energy companies and associations, system operators, consumer groups, academia, and NGOs. And I would like to thank all of them here for their contribution to this report. Now, what I will do in the next few minutes, first, I would like to share with you our thoughts about the global clean energy transition, where we are, especially after COP26, regarding to COP26, but also I would like to share a few thoughts about the issue position of Canada in the run to clean energy transitions. Now, COP26, Glasgow, we think COP26 achieved a lot. Did it achieve everything? No, but it did achieve a lot. And I thought some of the snap judgments that it was a failure was inaccurate, and B, they were not very helpful. I believe COP26 provided a substantial momentum for our clean energy transition. To give you a couple of examples, now at the end of COP or towards the COP26 and during the COP26, more than 80% of global emissions now are covered by commitments to net zero. Some of them 2050, some of them 2060, some even later, but there is a commitment there, and I think this is critically important. Now, having commitments is something, to implement is something else. But given even this signal, giving this signal, in my view, was very important. We at the IEA looked if all these commitments coming from North America, Latin America, Europe, China, Japan, India, many countries, if they were to be implemented fully as they were promised, what would it mean? It means, dear colleagues, if they were to be implemented, I underline this implemented, and fully, I also underline fully, the global temperature increase can be limited to 1.8 degrees Celsius. I think this is a promising number. This is a promising step. Of course, again, it doesn't mean that the governments are going to implement everything fully, but they put their intention. And the second, we know that the 1.8 is not 1.5, but I see it as a good step in the right direction. There are other good outcomes from Glasgow. One of them is, in my view, India. The announcement of India having a net zero goal. India is a strategic partner to International Energy Agency. We work very closely together. Only a few days ago, I got a letter from the Indian government asking IES assistance support to build a net zero roadmap with the milestones to help the Indian government there. This was, I think, very important. Unfortunately, it didn't get the traction that I hoped it should have gotten. This is one. Another one is on the methane, the very important, very potent gas, and the global agreement there, the global methane pledge, in my view, was a major achievement. When we look at all the countries, there are more than 100 countries, they have met that pledge, and I was particularly pleased to hear from Prime Minister Trudeau at the launch event in Glasgow of Canada's commitment to align its ambitions methane pledge in line with the International Energy Agency's own recommendation, as such being the first country in the world to do so. Moving from Glasgow today, are we optimistic or pessimistic? Now, when I look at some numbers, I am really optimistic. For example, we have just released the numbers that this year, of all the power plants installed, last year, I should say, last year, of all the power plants in 2021 installed in the world, 95% were renewables, mainly solar, wind, but also hydropower, 95%. 5% fossil fuels and 95% basically renewables. Very good news. Electric cars, record after record. In the year 2019, only 2% of all the cars sold in the world were electric cars, and last year it reached close to 10%, very quickly from 2% share to 10% share, close to 10% share, electric cars penetrating very quickly, and we expect even further acceleration of electric cars. Of course, these are very good and promising developments, but when we look at the broader picture, we also see that the global emissions in 2020 jumped record high. Why? Fossil fuel demand increased substantially. Here, the biggest issue, in my view, is coal. Our coal market report that we released only a few weeks ago tells us that in the year 2021, the coal power generation was the highest in the history. And in my view, this is a major issue. And not only the fact that we should not build new coal-fired power plants as much as possible, but even more importantly, what do we do with the over 2,000 gigawatts of installed, locked-in coal power capacity around the world? This is a big issue. How we phase them out, how we phase them down and up, it was discussed out in Glasgow. This is a major issue. For example, even if we don't build any single coal plant in the next 30 years, if the existing coal plants in the world were to run in line with their normal operation lifetime, our chances to reach our climate goal is close to zero. So therefore, we have to find ways to make sure that the coal phase out happens, especially in the emerging countries, especially in Asia. And I know there were a lot of efforts in Glasgow, towards Glasgow, in Glasgow, and I would like to hear comment Minister Wilkinson for his heroic efforts to find solutions here. I would like to also maybe announce that before going to Canada aspect, we have decided that the International Energy Agency this year makes a major work how to bring the coal emissions to zero in 2050, working with the developing countries to phase out the coal and bring it to zero. And I hope to get the support of our Canadian colleagues, including Mr. Wilkinson there. So, dear colleagues, our way to reach, global way to reach net zero by 2050 is a tough one. And to make this happen, will require huge efforts from developing and developed countries to have a affordable, secure, and just transition is critical for everybody, but also for the International Energy Agency. Now, a few words on Canada. Of course, Canada has been a cornerstone of global energy markets since years, a major, very important oil and gas country. While we move in the direction of clean energy, Canada has to transform itself. When we look at our work, some of you may know, I hope many of you know, last May, we made a report, Net Zero Roadmap for the world. We see that the electricity plays a very important role, growth of electricity. And our numbers show that in the year 2050, half of global consumption will need to come from clean electricity, zero emission electricity. But the other half is still to be met by fuels. When I say fuels, these are types of fuels that change over time with the rise of low carbon fuels like hydrogen and advanced biofuels, and the consumption of oil and gas has to diminish. They will diminish, and the demand has to decline. There is no way out. But I wanted to make clear that a declining demand doesn't mean tomorrow they will be zero. In our net zero roadmap for the world, for example, global oil consumption, which is about 100 million barrels per day today, will go around 25 million barrels per day in 2050, and the global gas consumption will be halved compared to today. So we will still need oil and gas for years to come, and therefore somebody has to produce that oil. Somebody has to produce that oil. And I prefer that that oil is produced by countries, A, produce them in a clean way, and B, they are reliable partners for the consumers. I will come to clean part in a minute, but talking about reliable, some of you may know that in Europe nowadays, we are going through a major natural gas crisis. Natural gas prices spiked very, very sharply, and it's a major issue for many households, industries, and others. One of the reasons that we are, in my view, seeing this big problem in Europe is that a big chunk of the European gas imports, about half of it, come from one single country, and this country's policies have a huge impact on the European energy mix, European energy security. As such, world needs reliable partners, market economies, AAA, like Canada. Therefore, I really wanted to underline this. The second part, the cleanliness, and I think the methane is a key issue here. I would like to very much highlight the very fact that Canada's efforts in order to minimize methane emission is of exemplary nature. And as such, Canada bring the methane emissions down, minimize them, venting, flaring, and making it as a source in terms of LNG, for example, replacing the coal I mentioned a few minutes ago, especially in the Asian economies, would be of great value through LNG to those countries. But dear colleagues, the oil and gas companies, their role is, I think, and the challenge they are facing is huge. In my view, not only the oil and gas producing countries, but oil and gas companies have to transform themselves. No company will be unaffected from the clean energy transitions. And I very much hope to see that the oil and gas companies become the part, maybe even a driver of the clean energy transitions, because they have a lot of expertise with managing major engineering projects. Many of them have deep pockets and a lot of technological, expertise. I would like to very much see that these companies are drivers of several clean energy technologies, ranging from hydrogen to carbon capture and storage and to sustainable bioenergy applications. So therefore, there is a big challenge for the also oil and gas companies, in addition to those nations who produce a substantial amount of oil and gas, like Canada. So, Mr. Wilkinson, dear colleagues, these are some of the thoughts I have for the oil and gas producers. The challenge is clear for them. They have to deliver not just the energy we use now, oil and gas, but also the emission reductions that we urgently need will be hinging on their political determination. And perhaps, again, to finish, I would like to say that I work with, discuss with many oil and gas producing countries around the world, and we follow their plans, programs, and the concrete steps they are making. And when I look at all of them and how much their efforts in terms of clean energy transitions, I can very easily, comfortably say that in terms of clean energy transition and taking it seriously and implementing it, Canada is definitely on the top league of all those oil and producing countries when it comes to addressing our climate challenges. I stop here and thank you very much for your attention. And I turn back to my colleague, Mr. Mullen.
Thank you, Dr. Birol. Our IEA energy analyst, Divya Redy, will now present the key findings of the IDR, the in-depth review. Over to you, Ms. Redy.
Thank you, Jethro, and good morning to you, Mr. Wilkinson, and other Canadian participants. So I'll now provide a brief overview of the main findings from our report. Since the last IEA review in 2015, Canada has put in place a series of international and domestic commitments that put the country on a path toward achieving an ambitious energy system transformation and a climate transition. This includes a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030 under the Paris Agreement, and more recently updating that pledge to 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. To underpin the targets, Canada has put in place a number of policy measures and strategies. This includes the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change in 2016 that laid the foundations for an energy transition and included a federal pricing mechanism for carbon. The 2022 carbon price in Canada is $50 per ton, and that is planned to increase by $15 per ton every year until 2030, when it reaches $170 per ton, making it among the strongest in the world. In December 2020, the federal government also proposed the Canada Strengthened Climate Plan, which includes 64 new measures and around $15 billion in new investments to help put the country on a pathway toward net zero emissions by 2050, as now legislated in the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. However, Canada's energy system today is still heavily dominated by fossil fuels. In 2020, the largest source of energy supply was natural gas, which accounted for 39% of supply, followed by oil at 33%. Canada's energy demand is still growing. Total final consumption of energy increased by 12% between 2009 and 2019, driven by economic growth. And in line with that, energy-related carbon dioxide emissions have also been steadily increasing in recent years. Regional differences also matter in the Canadian context, with some provinces being major oil and gas producers, others having an abundance of hydro and other renewable resources, while a number of remote communities remain heavily dependent on diesel for electricity generation. Canada's shared jurisdictional model for energy sector governance also presents a structural challenge, which requires that the federal government work very closely with provincial and territorial authorities to align key energy and climate goals, regulations, and standards to meet national targets. Canada already has one of the cleanest electricity systems in the world, dominated by hydropower, with about 83% today of generation coming from non-emitting sources, and a plan to increase that to 90% by 2030. Early actions like the federal commitment to phase out unabated coal-fired generation, as well as some new hydro projects, will help toward that end. Still, the planned electrification of the economy to meet climate targets means that an additional build-out of zero emissions generation will also be necessary. Importantly, renewable resources are not uniformly distributed across Canada. and several provinces have a high dependency on natural gas for power generation. Given that increased interconnectivity across regions will be essential to helping fossil fuel dependent provinces decarbonize and electrify their economies toward meeting national targets. The role of nuclear energy is recognized as fundamental to achieving and sustaining Canada's climate goals, and the technology is seen as a long-term source of electricity, baseload electricity supply, with major nuclear plant extensions currently underway in the province of Ontario. The development of small modular reactors is also a key priority for the long term. Turning now to energy efficiency, Canada in 2019 still had the highest energy intensity of GDP among IEA member countries and the second highest per capita. Energy intensity since 2000 has fallen at a similar rate to other IEA countries, but additional effort will be needed to meet climate targets. Energy efficiency in Canada, like many other things, is a shared jurisdictional responsibility between the federal and provincial and territorial governments. And the federal government has built partnerships and invested heavily in energy efficiency improvements already. In August of 2017, Natural Resources Canada released the Build Smart, Canada's building strategy, in cooperation with provinces and territories, which was also underpinned by sizable budgetary outlays to improve energy efficiency through home and building design, retrofits and new builds, as well as updated building codes for both new and existing buildings that are currently underway. In addition, financial support was directed as part of Canada's COVID recovery plans toward buildings renovation. In other sectors, NRCan's Industrial Energy Efficiency Program helps industry improve efficiency through implementation of energy management systems and other benchmarking tools. And in the transport sector, the government applies emission standards to light and heavy duty vehicles, green levies on fuel inefficient vehicles, consumer information tools, and also helps companies retrofit and fuel switch freight vehicles. In June of last year, the federal government also announced an intention to set a target for 100% sales of zero emissions vehicles by 2035, which is a significant acceleration from previous commitments. Canada's oil and gas sector is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and accounts for around a quarter of total emissions in the country, and will need to be addressed as part of an overall emissions reduction strategy. The industry has made inroads in reducing the emissions intensity of operations, which have fallen by 32% since 1990 in the oil sands. An additional 17 to 27% reduction in emissions intensity is expected over the period between 2018 and 2030, but still more work is needed to meet 2030 and 2050 targets, given that reductions in emissions intensity are also partially offset by increased production. As of July 2020, Canada requires methane reductions from upstream oil and gas facilities of 40 to 45% below 2012 levels by 2025, including by requiring industry to regularly inspect and repair equipment. And more recently, in October of last year, the government strengthened that pledge or target to 70% below 2012 levels by 2030. In the fall of 2020, the government also launched the $750 million emissions reduction fund as part of its COVID-19 response measures to assist oil and gas companies reduce greenhouse gas emissions, especially methane, and also to help keep oil and gas sector workers employed during the period of economic recovery. Canada is also leveraging its abundant natural gas supply to position itself as a global LNG supplier, with the focus on reducing emissions from LNG facilities to well below the global average, including by leveraging clean hydroelectricity to power operations in the West. Clean fuels also represent an opportunity for Canada to transition its existing energy sector to a low carbon future. Clean fuels here include hydrogen, advanced biofuels, renewable natural gas, sustainable aviation fuels, and synthetic fuels. Today, clean fuels make up only less than 5% of Canada's energy supply, but the government estimates that 60% or more of energy demand could be met by clean fuels by 2050. Given Canada's biomass advantage, there's also a significant opportunity for a range of sustainable biomass feedstocks to be used for producing and exporting clean fuels. To advance clean fuels, Canada has introduced a number of measures, including clean fuels regulations, a clean fuels fund, and a hydrogen strategy, all of which are designed to leverage existing strengths in the energy system. And then finally, with respect to energy technology innovation, Canada spent around 0.6% of its GDP on energy-related R&D in 2020, ranking third among IEA countries. And improving the rate of technology innovation will be really essential to achieving the kind of deep decarbonization, especially in hard-to-abate sectors, that's necessary to meet net zero emissions by 2050. Toward that end, Canada has focused recent efforts in a number of technology areas, including carbon capture, utilization, and storage, hydrogen, and nuclear small modular reactors, with a view to also serving as a global supplier of clean energy solutions. Canada is already a global leader in CCUS, with 4 of the world's 26 commercial projects in operation, as well as extensive expertise in research and development. And these technologies can notably play an important role in decarbonizing upstream crude oil production. So I'll stop there and hand the floor back over to Dr. Birol to highlight some of the key policy recommendations from our report. Thank you.
Why don't we have this slide there, and I can go through the slide and show it to our Canadian colleagues. First of all, as I said in the beginning of my remarks, that Canada has been a cornerstone of global energy markets, a reliable partner years and years. And now, again, the country is a leader in the clean energy transition. I also appreciate that there is a lot of emphasis on just transition, fair transition. Now, we have in our report, you will see we have several, in my view, important recommendations for the Canadian colleagues to consider, but I would like to highlight only 3 of them. I think the Canada needs to define precise pathways to reach net zero by 2050. What are the national emission reduction strategies for key consuming sectors? This is number 1. Then we would like to see also those policies are implemented, especially in the upstream sector, to enable the oil and gas exports with net zero ambitions. How we are going to reconcile that? This is extremely important, while at the same time, of course, making sure that Canada fulfills its important role being an important supplier of oil and gas to the global markets. But how do we bring the emissions down in the upstream sector, a critical one? Then we would also like to see that Canada increases its financial support to accelerate research and development, as well as innovation in clean energy technologies. What are those? Carbon capture and storage, methane, hydrogen, among others. And I would like to also make emphasis here and appreciate Canada's leadership in the context of the small modular reactors. And in that respect, in all these 3 areas and the others, we at the IEA, the Global Energy Authority, we are very happy to support Canadian government's efforts as it undertakes an ambitious clean energy transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that presentation. We will now hear from Minister Wilkinson of Canada for his thoughts on the IEA's review of Canada's policies.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today, and thank you very much to the IEA and to Dr. Birol. I think it's the first time we've seen each other since COP. And certainly thank you for all the work that you and your team have done with respect to the in-depth review, and for all of the great work that the IEA does on the energy transition around the world. I am pleased to be joining you today from my constituency of North Vancouver, which is located on the traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Le monde est en train de changer, se dirigeant chaque jour plus rapidement vers une économie à faible émission de carbone. Le Canada est en mesure de bénéficier de manière significative des possibilités économiques offertes par cette transition. Here in Canada, we certainly don't need to be sold on the merits of a clean energy future. And as an aside, and by pure coincidence, it was announced today by Global Clean Tech 100 that 13 of the world's top 100 clean tech companies are actually based here in Canada. So we are already on our way towards taking full advantage of the opportunities that will be created through this transition. But in order to do so across all sectors of the economy and across all regions of this country, and to do both in a timely manner, we have to be thoughtful in our approach. And that is why I am very happy today to share that the IEA's in-depth review of Canada's approach to the energy transition is, in my estimation, very positive overall, as you have heard from Dr. Birol and his colleagues. Ce rapport reconnaît nos efforts ambitieux et nos investissements historiques pour développer des voies permettant d'atteindre des zéro émission nette d'ici 2050 et d'assurer une transition conforme à notre objectif commun de limiter le réchauffement climatique à 1,5 degrés Celsius. Ces voies sont les plus avantageuses pour notre population, notre économie et notre pays, mais elles permettront également d'obtenir des technologies, des produits et un savoir-faire qui pourront être exportés et appliqués à travers le monde. The IEA is one of the world's most trusted voices on energy, and it's both rewarding and reassuring to have the agency acknowledge our impressive leadership, as they put it, on climate action, while commending our ambitious efforts and historic investments to get Canada to net zero emissions by 2050. Let me be clear, this review matters because how we build Canada's clean energy future is extremely important in determining the future prosperity of families and workers and communities across our country. Canada faces challenges and opportunities that are unique to our climate, our geography, our demographics, and certainly our economy. Our climate action has to reflect that. Canada is blessed with an abundance of natural resources that position us to be a global leader in clean energy. We have ample land for solar and wind farms, vast water systems for hydroelectric power, geological formations conducive to the sequestration of captured carbon, critical minerals for clean technologies, uranium needed for nuclear energy, and of course, significant traditional sources of energy. A key to Canada's clean energy future will be empowering our workers to harness Canada's vast resources in ways that make sense environmentally and economically for their region. And that is exactly what our government is focused on. To date, since 2015, we have committed more than $100 billion towards climate action and clean growth. And that includes major investments in clean power, energy efficiency, industrial decarbonization, clean technology, and transportation. We also have a world-leading price on pollution and stringent regulations, as well as action plans for promising technologies like hydrogen and small modular reactors. We are also working to finalize our carbon capture, utilization, and storage strategy. All of this is intended to ensure that we grow our economy as emissions go down at a pace and on a scale that is aligned with our 1.5 degrees Celsius targets. We know, however, that more must be done. And in fact, the IEA has pointed to this in a number of the recommendations that it has provided in this report. Certainly, it will be important to define pathways to achieve net zero by 2050 that are specifically relevant to Canada. That is why we put into place the Net Zero Advisory Body last year with a specific mandate to help us and to provide advice to us about the pathways to 2050. We clearly have delineated and will be bringing forward a very detailed plan within the next couple of months with respect to what we intend to do to achieve our targets for 2030. But certainly we need to go further in terms of mapping out the pathways for 2050, and we are in the process of doing that. We also, as the report notes, need to define policies to ensure that we are reducing emissions with respect to the oil and gas space in this country. And that is something that, again, we are working on actively. As Dr. Birol talked about, we have committed, we were the first country, oil and gas producer, to commit to the 75% reduction in methane target by 2030. We have now announced, subsequent to the work that was done in this report, that we will be capping oil and gas emissions, and we will be requiring 5-year binding reductions on a pathway to 2050 moving forward. And certainly a third area that the report talks about is accelerating investments in research and development with respect to clean technologies. And I am certainly in accord with that. My background, I come from the clean technology space. I was a CEO in that space for many years. It is certainly something that I understand has to be critical in terms of enabling the deployment and the development and ultimate deployment of newer technologies that will help us to get to where we need to go between now and 2050. And we are certainly looking at a number of additional instruments beyond what we have already done with respect to both research and development, but also with respect to deployment and finding ways to mobilize private capital to be involved in helping us to get there. Mais bien sûr, comme l'indique clairement le rapport de l'AIA, pour qu'une nation individuelle réussisse, nous devons tous réussir. C'est ce que reflète le leadership du Canada lors de la COP26 en novembre. Nous travaillons avec nos partenaires internationaux pour faire en sorte que le Canada soutienne une transition véritablement globale. Notre travail a été souligné à la COP26 où j'ai eu la chance d'annoncer que le Canada, les États-Unis, le Royaume-Uni et quelques autres, 20 autres pays, cesseront tout nouveau soutien direct au secteur international de la production soutenue d'énergie à partir de combustibles fossiles d'ici la fin de 2022. Aussi, livrer le plan de mise en œuvre du financement de la lutte contre le changement climatique et à mobiliser 100 milliards de dollars par an en financement pour l'action climatique. Ce plan de mise en œuvre tourné vers l'avenir montre que les pays en développement feront important avancer vers l'objectif de 100 milliards de dollars en 2022 et porte à croire que cet objectif sera atteint en 2023. Et aussi instaurer un partenariat entre le Canada et l'Agence internationale pour les énergies renouvelables visant à faciliter la transition vers les énergies renouvelables dans les collectivités éloignées de la planète. I am personally very proud of the progress that Canada has made during the past 6 years. We have a long way to go, but I believe that the future is bright. This report, in my mind, is a validation of the work that the federal government has been doing over the past 6 years. It is also a call for continued and sustained action to ensure that Canada and the world move aggressively forward to create an environmentally sustainable and economically prosperous future. And to Dr. Birol's comment with respect to coal, I would certainly say that Canada agrees that the first and most important step that we need to do is to find pathways to help the rest of the world phase out coal, as Canada is doing by 2030. Canada has led with the United Kingdom, the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is focused on that. And we would welcome the opportunity to partner with the International Energy Agency on finding ways to further the work that we have been doing to ensure that we are actually making the progress that we must make if we are to leave a habitable planet for our children. I would like to very much thank the IEA for all of the great work they do to help countries build a clean energy future, and specifically very much for this report.
We now have time to take some questions. We invite the journalists in attendance to send your questions through the Q&A function in the Zoom. We'll take a 2-minute break while you send those questions. We'll be back shortly. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for your questions. There are a lot of them. We're going to cover as many as we can in the time we have left. We're going to start with one for Minister Wilkinson from Emma Graney of the Globe and Mail. The IEA report says Canada needs to model pathways to net zero in consultation with provinces and industry. What is the plan aside from setting goals? When will consultations start? And how are you planning to get Alberta on board, given the political differences that can cloud those conversations? So I'll pass to Minister Wilkinson for that question to him.
Well, I would say to Emma, I mean, those conversations have been ongoing for a long time, and they will continue. I think there's a couple of different elements to the conversations. One is, the focus on areas of major opportunities for emissions reductions that are modeled in the plan that we have presented and will be modeled in the emissions reductions plan that Minister Guilbeault will be presenting as part of the Bill C-12 or the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Reduction Act that is required by late March. But the other part of it is actually working with provinces and territories with respect to the areas of economic opportunity for them that certainly involve both emissions reductions, but also jobs that will come from the work that will be done. And certainly in the context of Alberta, for example, that would include hydrogen, which relates to what we are going to do with respect to carbon capture and sequestration. it relates to biofuels, it relates to critical minerals. There's a whole range of opportunities there. And those conversations I have been having with my colleagues, and I will be having more intensely with my colleagues over the coming few months. Certainly, you know, our ideal scenario would be that all provinces and territories have a target that is aligned with the federal target, like Quebec and British Columbia and a number of others. But certainly, we intend to continue the dialogue and work with all provinces to make progress. But our climate plan is not premised on provinces and territories making significant additional actions. It is premised on the work that the federal government has done and the excellent work that some provinces have already done to advance emissions reductions in their economies.
Wilkinson. The next question is one that's come from a few different outlets, including Bloomberg and CTV. So we're going to try and cover all of them with one question. It focuses on the question that the report notes that Canada must focus on significantly decarbonising its oil and gas sectors, while at the same time ensuring competitiveness in increasingly well-supplied world markets. This is the question from Robert Tuttle from Bloomberg. Is it possible for Canada to remain a major oil supplier in a world that's pushing towards net zero emissions? How can Canada do both of those things? I think Ms. Redy, the lead author of the report, is going to take this question. I'm not sure if Minister Wilkinson would want to add anything afterwards, but I'll turn to Ms. Redy for the first up.
Yeah, so basically the key for Canada, as Dr. Birol mentioned, there will still continue to be a role for fuels, including some oil and gas in a net zero pathway. However, the key to remain competitive in that is not just to be cost competitive, but also to be environmentally competitive. And in that sense, putting in place the right policy signals that enable the kinds of investments you need in technology to really significantly decarbonize upstream oil and gas production from where it is today will be crucial to allow Canada to kind of play in that space. Thank you.
Maybe I can just add a couple of things.
Minister Wilkinson, did you want to add anything to that question of how can Canada remain a major supplier and push towards net zero?
Sure, I agree with the comments that were made, but what I would say is, you know, in this period where we are moving through a transition, there will continue to be significant amounts of both oil and gas utilized as we go through this, and ultimately, by 2050, according to the IEA scenario, there's still a reasonable amount of those products that are being consumed. What Canada must do is reduce the emissions associated with the extraction and the production of those fuels. And we have made commitments with respect to capping emissions and requiring binding 5-year reductions with respect to the emissions associated with that. Concurrently, though, obviously, we have to reduce the demand for these products in terms of them being combusted. Domestically, we are doing that through the deployment of zero-emission technologies. Oil is primarily used for transportation purposes. And we have said that there will be no internal combustion engines sold in this country after 2035 for light-duty vehicles. That is something that will drive down demand. We are going to be working with partners around the world to help them to move in the same direction. And certainly we see those kinds of commitments from Europe and the United States and a range of others. And so in that context, Canada needs to ensure that it's driving down its own emissions and is providing products that will continue to be used in some measure that are the lowest intensity and emissions intensity possible. And that is part of an overarching plan to achieve net zero here and to help achieve net zero around the world.
We've got time for one more question. We've had a few questions on CCUS, carbon capture, utilization and storage, in the context of Canada's energy sector and climate ambitions. This one, I'm taking the one from Nia Williams from Reuters. The Canadian oil and gas industry and the Alberta government are placing a lot of emphasis on CCUS as a way of cutting emissions while still producing fossil fuels. Is this the right approach, or should there be more emphasis on reducing oil and gas output altogether? And I think Dr. Birol is going to take this question.
Okay, with pleasure. Dear colleagues, we have to understand that today the world consumes 100 million barrels per day of oil, and there is no way, but first of all, we have to bring the oil consumption substantially down if we want to reach our climate goals. This is one. So the consumption should go down. Therefore, in line with that, the output should go down. But output will not be zero tomorrow. There will be a need in different parts of the world to supply oil. And once again, I would like to get this oil from countries, good partners, reliable partners like Canada, who wants to reduce the emissions of oil and gas. This is number one. Demand should go down. Second, the production of oil and gas should be clean. And Canada is an exemplary country here in terms of methane emission, in terms of the many companies in their own domestic processes, oil and gas companies using clean electricity. This is number one, reducing the emissions of oil and gas production processes. And number three, CCUS. Leave Canada aside, if you ask me, we at the IEA look, when we make this global roadmap, net zero roadmap for the world, we look at more than 800 technologies one by one. If you ask me, choose a most critical technology out of 800, definitely CCUS would be one of the top three. It is so important that in the absence of CCUS, reaching our climate goals will be much more difficult, if at all possible. So therefore, we need all these three. Demand, bring the demand down, but in the meantime, while demand is going down, declining demand, to supply it with the oil and gas that are as much as possible clean. And third, getting new technologies on board to reduce the emissions, such as the critical one, carbon capture and storage. Since it is the last question, perhaps I can take this opportunity once again. IEA is not very famous being so complimentary, but I would like to once again say, my Canadian colleagues, that the way that the Canadian government, as a major oil and gas producer, is taking the climate action is of exemplary nature, and therefore I would like to thank Mr. Wilkinson, Mr. Minister, on behalf of the Canadian government, and we want to see those plans, those strategies will be implemented as Mr. Minister highlighted. Thank you very much.
We'll now offer Minister Wilkinson a chance to offer any closing remarks he'd like to give before we conclude the press webinar. Minister Wilkinson.
Well, I would just again like to thank Dr. Birol and the IEA for the report and for all the work. I would also like to thank them for the leadership that they have shown with respect to helping us to define pathways to achieve a viable net zero future. And certainly Canada looks forward to continuing to work constructively with the IEA on many of the issues that we have talked about today. As I said during my remarks, Canada views the report as, in many respects, a validation of some of the hard work that we have done over the past 6 years to fight climate change, to set up a program to reduce significantly the emissions in our economy, but to do so in a way that is unique to Canada, that will allow us to seize the economic opportunities that exist. And certainly I look forward to continuing to implement that and continuing to have an active dialogue with the IEA to ensure that we are actually making the progress that we need to make, and to ensure that we're sharing some of the lessons that we are learning with others around the world who are endeavoring to make the same kind of progress that we are endeavoring to make. So thank you once again to the IEA. I certainly very much appreciate the report and the ongoing partnership.
Thank you, Dr. Birol and Ms. Redy, for your contributions, and thank you very much to the journalists for the excellent questions. And thank you to everyone who's following this event online for your interest in our work. For any journalists whose questions we didn't get to, please do follow up with our press office, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And with that, I'd like to conclude this press webinar. Thank you and goodbye.